You lie in your bed, still and listening, while we journey back in time to the late 16th century, deep into the court of one of England's most iconic monarchs. Queen Elizabeth I is remembered for her intellect, her power, and her virginity, but rarely for the daily discomforts she endured beneath her regal facade. This is the quieter story of her life, the less glamorous one, a tale of fabric, skin, lice, and the curious reality of royal hygiene. Here, the crown itched, not just metaphorically, but literally. Let's begin in the heart of Elizabethan England. The year is 1588. While the country was preparing for the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth herself was dressing, layer after layer, each one stiffer, heavier, and more elaborate than the last. A typical royal ensemble for the Queen might include a linen smock, a corset stiffened with whalebone, a petticoat or two, a farthingale hoop skirt, a richly embroidered gown, sleeves sewn separately and tied in, velvet oversleeves, lace cuffs, and a ruff so starched it could practically stand on its own. Her clothing, while beautiful, was less about comfort and more about control, discipline, and quite plainly royal propaganda. What lay beneath all this, however, rarely saw daylight. Linen undergarments were supposed to absorb sweat and keep the body clean, but they were seldom changed. Water was considered dangerous. Many physicians believed it opened the skin's pores and let illness seep in. So, bathing was rare. Instead, cleanliness was attempted through dry washing, rubbing the body with linen cloths, sprinkling rosewater, or applying layers of powders to mask odour. But with these heavy garments came an unspoken curse: parasites. Fleas and lice were common companions in noble courts. Flea traps, little hollowed pieces of fur, were placed inside bodices or beneath petticoats to lure the insects away from the skin. Queen Elizabeth, despite her royal status, was no exception to this infestation. Her wigs and elaborate ruffs provided perfect hiding places for lice. Royal laundresses were often employed not just to clean clothes, but to shake out insects. When courtiers bowed, it was not just etiquette, it kept their heads lowered, sometimes mercifully, from each other's crawling guests. The Queen's iconic white face paint, known as Venetian ceruse, was made from lead. It cracked with heat, invited infection when worn over sores, and contributed to a cycle of skin damage that required even more paint. Washing it off wasn't easy either. Ointments made from egg whites, vinegar, or even urine were used to remove layers of caked-on powder. But these cleaning methods were hardly sanitary. In fact, the Queen's hygiene routine, if one could call it that, was as much a performance as her politics. Historical letters and records suggest that she bathed infrequently. A note from her godson, Sir John Harrington, reveals that she had a special bath built at Richmond Palace, but it's unlikely she used it often. Baths were still considered luxuries, or worse, health hazards. The idea of scrubbing oneself with soap and water every day, as we do now, would have seemed both unnecessary and suspiciously foreign. Instead, Elizabeth relied on layers of perfume and sachets of herbs to ward off stench. Rose petals, lavender, cloves, and even dried oranges stuffed with vinegar-soaked sponges were tucked into her sleeves and bodice. Yet despite all these efforts, foul smells were common in the court. One courtier once wrote that the Queen smelt of ambergris, musk, and the restless sweat of ruling. But perhaps most telling is the fact that Elizabeth had a royal official, one of many, whose entire job was to oversee her wardrobe. The mistress of the robes managed not just the rotation of garments, but also their maintenance. That meant mending mothholes, brushing out lice, and discreetly ensuring that the Queen's unwashed underthings didn't raise any gossip. Even with a palace full of servants, secrecy about bodily discomfort was a top priority. This secrecy extended to menstruation as well. While rarely discussed in official documents, historians believe that Elizabeth, like most women of her time, used folded cloths, or rags, to manage her monthly bleeding. There were no sanitary belts, no disposable pads. Everything was reusable and quietly handed off to female attendants to clean, dry, and return. Privacy was paramount. The Queen's chambers were sacred not just for politics, but for preserving the illusion that a monarch's body was somehow beyond the mess of ordinary life. Yet the truth persisted. Beneath the gilded gowns and polished pearls, Elizabeth's body itched. Her scalp flaked. Her breath, perhaps, was tinged with the decay of toothaches. Her skin, caked in lead, bore sores that she had to carefully conceal, and every day she dressed and undressed with the help of silent maids who never spoke of what they saw, because to speak of the Queen's discomforts was to risk your post, or worse, your head. We often imagine royalty as above the common dirt of life, but this image was crafted, polished, and aggressively maintained. Elizabeth's public face may have shone like the moon, but her private life was filled with the silent struggle of maintaining illusion under layers of pain, perfume, and parasites. And as you drift deeper into sleep, you might wonder, how did a woman so powerful endure such daily discomfort without ever letting the world see her flinch? As we return to the quiet corridors of Elizabethan palaces, you may imagine the Queen not on her throne, but in the solitude of her bedchamber, surrounded by fabrics, perfumes, and silence. This is where the reality of being royal came to light, and not the romanticised kind. In the early morning hours before the bustle of politics began, Elizabeth's day would start not with a regal decree, but with a careful undressing of yesterday's burdens and the reassembly of her royal image, and it took a team of women sworn to secrecy and skilled in silence to make it happen. Queen Elizabeth I's chamber was not a private place in the way we might understand it. Her dressing process was ceremonial. She was rarely alone. Up to 20 attendants might assist her at any given moment, depending on the occasion, including the chief gentlewoman of the bedchamber, ladies-in-waiting, and maids whose jobs ranged from carrying her wash basins to folding cloths for her menstruation. Each woman had a strict role. One fluffed her ruff, another brushed her wigs, another fastened her sleeves. The Queen said little. Orders were rarely spoken above a whisper. The room, for all its beauty, wall hangings of silk, carved bedposts, golden hand mirrors, was filled with something less refined. A smell. Not necessarily a foul one, but dense, layered, and inescapable. The scent of lavender and rose petals clashed with musty velvet, stale powders, and the underlying odour of a body that hadn't bathed in days or even weeks. When the Queen removed her outer garments, the underlayers, smocks, corsets, and petticoats, were often damp with sweat. These, if not too soiled, might be aired out and reworn. There is no confirmed record of Elizabeth owning more than a handful of linen undergarments, which were expensive and time-consuming to launder. Her laundry schedule was sporadic. Washing was done manually, with harsh lye-based soaps that damaged fabric and skin alike. Because of this, garments were often brushed, aired, and scented rather than fully washed. If lice were found, clothing might be boiled or smoked over herbs, but not scrubbed. Doing so would risk fraying the precious stitching. The Queen's ruffs, those vast circular collars we see in paintings, needed particular care. They were starched to a knife-like stiffness using a paste made from flour and water, then set with heated irons. These ruffs were not just itchy and uncomfortable, but hazardous to health. They scraped the neck, restricted movement, and trapped sweat underneath. Maids sometimes had to hold perfumes or herbal pouches to Elizabeth's face while she dressed, just to keep her from gagging on the stifling scent of starch and sweat. Let's now return to the hair. Elizabeth's hair was another source of both pride and pain. In youth, she had reddish blonde locks, but as she aged and her hair thinned, she turned to wigs. These were not elegant pieces by modern standards. Wigs were heavy, hot, and difficult to keep clean. They were sometimes stuffed with cotton or horsehair for volume and secured with pins and glue. The scalp beneath, rarely washed, poorly ventilated, often developed sores or infestations. There are rumours, never quite confirmed, that Elizabeth developed bald patches from years of wig wear and skin reactions to her cosmetics. To maintain the illusion of vitality, Elizabeth's face was painted daily. Thick coats of lead-based white paint covered blemishes and scars, many of which were caused by smallpox, which she survived in her youth. To remove the paint, her attendants used a mixture of vinegar and mercury, a corrosive combination that ate away at skin over time. The result was a cycle of damage and concealment. If she had sores, she painted them. If the paint made them worse, she added more layers. Her teeth, too, were a source of concern. Sugar had become fashionable during her reign, and Elizabeth reportedly enjoyed candied violets and marzipan. Dental care, however, was primitive. Toothbrushes were made from horsehair or cloth. Pastes might include salt, soot, or honey. Over time, the Queen's teeth blackened and decayed, and she experienced toothache so severe that she had to have one extracted, with no anaesthesia but a swig of wine and brute force. Foreign ambassadors noted her difficulty speaking during long audiences, possibly due to pain or missing teeth. But the discomfort did not end there. In moments of illness or menstruation, Elizabeth had to trust a few select women to assist her, women who were trained not only in care but in discretion. Doctors were called only in dire circumstances. Most health problems were treated with poultices, leeches, herbal infusions, and an alarming array of bleeding techniques. And still, the Queen was expected to appear composed. Her discomfort was never to become public knowledge. Monarchs did not groan. Monarchs did not scratch. Monarchs did not bleed. A royal woman's life was tightly corseted not just in silk, but in expectations. To be royal was to be untouchable, unflinching, and unspoiled, even if you were itching, sweating, and in pain every hour of the day. The body was a battlefield, and victory meant appearing untouched. Even the furniture was designed to hide discomfort. Royal chairs had high backs to allow a queen to lean without appearing slouched. Beds were enclosed with heavy drapes not for luxury, but to trap warmth and smells. Some chairs had chamber pots built into them, hidden under removable cushions. Maids would clean these pots regularly, but never in view of the Queen herself. What we learn from all this is not that Elizabeth was unusually dirty. Rather, she was typical of her time. Water was feared, dirt was concealed, smells were layered over with more smells, and through it all she reigned. She gave speeches, she negotiated treaties, she survived assassination plots, palace conspiracies, and courtly betrayals, all while enduring lice, toothaches, sweating beneath pounds of fabric, and managing a monthly cycle in secret. The remarkable thing is not that she was unclean by our standards, it's that she functioned at all. Elizabeth's resilience wasn't just political, it was physical. Day after day she wore the costume of power and bore its discomforts without fail. Every morning she allowed herself to be assembled piece by piece until she was no longer a woman in pain, but a monarch without flaw. And yet, behind the mask of beauty and ceremony was a real woman, aging, itching, aching. A woman who had to lead while never showing weakness, who ruled a nation while her body quietly endured the burden of being both human and royal. As you sink deeper into sleep, ask yourself, what secrets were whispered in the Queen's chamber? What truths were held in the silence of women's hands brushing her hair, fastening her corset, or applying her poisons of beauty? Now that we've seen what lay beneath the velvet and lace, the parasites, the powders, and the pain, it's time to look at how Queen Elizabeth had turned that discomfort into an unshakable part of her public image. This final part of her story is not just about hygiene, but about how filth and glory could live side by side. It is about the discipline of illusion, the choreography of queenship, and the hidden power in pretending not to suffer. Imagine standing in front of the Queen, close enough to smell her. Not the Queen of your imagination, the stately regal figure from portraits, but the real Elizabeth. Her gown rustles with stiff silk, her neck constricted by a ruff soaked in starch and perfume. Her face, a smooth mask of white lead, shows no pores, no blemishes, no emotions. And yet behind that stillness, there's a woman trying not to scratch an inflamed scalp beneath her wig, hiding a sore inside her cheek, pressing her knees together because the corset has pinched a nerve. In the grand halls of Whitehall or Hampton Court, she stood under massive canopies, not just for dramatic effect, but to shield herself from sudden breezes that might lift her skirts and expose the grim realities beneath. Curtains weren't merely decorative, they were protective, preserving the illusion of untouchability. Even her throne was slightly elevated to make it harder for onlookers to smell the natural odours that no queen, however powerful, could truly banish. And yet, Elizabeth was often described as magnetic. When she addressed troops at Tilbury in 1588, in armour rather than court dress, she spoke of having the heart and stomach of a king. But she didn't have the stomach of a king. She had the stomach of a woman burdened with monthly bleeding, digestive distress from lead-based makeup, and constant discomfort from rigid clothing. Still, no one ever saw her wince. She stood tall and unyielding because her entire reign depended on it. The courtiers around her helped maintain this illusion. They were trained not just in diplomacy, but in denial. No one remarked on the sores hidden under powder, or the darkened teeth that made her speech slurred in later years. They bowed deeper when her breath smelled of rot. They accepted her mood swings, possibly aggravated by chronic pain or mercury poisoning, as divine unpredictability. In a court built on appearances, acknowledging the Queen's humanity could mean exile or worse. But what happened when the mask cracked? In her later years, Elizabeth became more reclusive. She reportedly refused to let doctors touch her, even when she was clearly ill. She avoided mirrors after her hair fell out and her skin became more discoloured. The last official portrait of her, the so-called rainbow portrait, shows her unnaturally youthful, with skin as smooth as porcelain, draped in bright fabrics and symbols of virtue. By then, she was in her late 60s and deeply unwell, but she allowed no visual trace of decline. When her longtime lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, placed a mirror where Elizabeth could see herself, the Queen reportedly flew into a rage and shattered it. Whether this story is literal or symbolic, it tells us something deeper. Elizabeth didn't want to see the truth of her own body. She had become her image so fully that reality had to be denied, even to herself, and in death the illusion was preserved. When Elizabeth died in 1603, her body was immediately covered and kept away from public eyes. The white makeup that had so long defined her face was not seen peeling off. The wigs, the padded sleeves, the laced bodices, all of it was put away. Her corpse was shown in state dressed like a queen, not like a decayed woman who had not bathed regularly in years. No post-mortem scandal was allowed to stain the myth. But history, slowly and quietly, has peeled back some of those layers. We now understand that her power came not despite her suffering, but because of her ability to bear it with composure. She used beauty as a weapon and cleanliness as a performance. In a time when bodily discomfort was normal and bathing rare, she learned to endure more than most, and to do it without ever letting her subjects know. The legacy of Elizabeth I is not just in laws or literature or naval victories. It's in the strange, silent strength of a woman who ruled an empire while every day enduring a war with her own body. Her example reminds us that royalty is not comfort, it is costumed control. And sometimes control means sitting perfectly still while your scalp bleeds under a wig, smiling politely while your gums ache, and ruling a country while silently suffering in layers of soiled linen. So, as you lay still tonight, drifting deeper into quiet thought, consider this. If power must always be pristine, how much pain must be hidden to keep it looking clean? It is hard to picture filth in a palace like Versailles. The moment you imagine Marie Antoinette, your mind likely paints an image of powdered hair, towering cakes, perfumed rooms, and satin gowns swirling through marble halls. But the reality behind that fantasy is far less polished, and often deeply unpleasant. In this first section, we explore how the Queen of France, at the height of her luxury, lived in a world saturated with perfumes, sweat, spoiled food, and the smell of too many bodies in a place with too few toilets. Versailles was more than a palace, it was a political theatre, and Marie Antoinette, from the moment she arrived from Austria in 1770 as a 14-year-old bride, was its most watched actress. Her every movement was monitored and rehearsed. From waking to sleeping, she lived her life as a performance, wrapped in rules and rituals designed to remind everyone, especially herself, that she belonged to France, not to herself. The Queen did not wake up alone. Every morning her lever, rising ceremony, involved a rotating group of courtiers who had the honour of dressing her. The privilege of handing her a shift, a stocking, or even a ribbon was determined by rank. The higher your noble title, the closer you stood to the Queen's nakedness. But this wasn't an intimate affair. It was crowded, cold, and often quite uncomfortable. Before any clothing could be put on, Marie Antoinette had to be refreshed. This didn't involve a bath, not in the way we imagine. Bathtubs existed at Versailles, but bathing the full body was rare and sometimes viewed as risky. Medical advice of the day warned that water could weaken the body's natural defences or open the skin to disease. So instead of bathing, the Queen was cleaned with cloth soaked in scented vinegar or rose water. Her face and hands were wiped gently. Any unpleasant odours, sweat, menstrual blood, morning breath, were masked with powerful perfumes, not removed. Perfume was not just a luxury, it was a necessity. Versailles stank. Despite its grandeur, the palace had no proper sewage system, and chamber pots were emptied into nearby corridors, gardens, or even fireplaces. Guests and residents, sometimes thousands at a time, relieved themselves in stairwells or behind curtains. The air in Marie Antoinette's apartments was thick with a constant blend of lavender, musk, body odour, animal fat, spilled wine, and damp fabric. People fainted regularly, not from daintiness, but from the sheer weight of smell. And then came the makeup. To match the pale aesthetic of the court, Marie Antoinette's attendants painted her skin with lead-based white foundation, much like Elizabeth Thorns before her. Rouge, made from crushed insects or cinnabar, a toxic mercury compound, was applied to her cheeks. Her lips were tinted with red wax. Her eyebrows were sometimes enhanced with grey or black powder, and her wig was powdered with flour mixed with lavender. All of this was done before breakfast. Wigs deserve a closer look. Though Marie Antoinette occasionally preferred simpler hairstyles, fashion demanded elaborate structures. These were not just for show, they were statements of status. Wigs could be over 3 feet tall, supported with wire frames and adorned with ships, birds, or even fruit arrangements. It could take hours to build these creations. Once in place, they stayed for days or even weeks. This meant sleeping upright, scratching at lice through powder, and suffering under the combined heat of hair, wool, and the occasional rat nest. Underneath all this artistry was a real woman, sweating through layers of corsets, petticoats, and panniers. Those wide side hoops that made skirts look like floating clouds. Each layer trapped heat and moisture, and changing clothes multiple times a day meant being undressed and redressed in front of spectators, always with ceremony. Her undergarments, usually made of linen, were not washed daily. In fact, most were merely aired out or brushed off before reuse. Her menstrual cycle was managed with cloth rags held in place by drawstring underpants or tight garters. There were no modern pads or tampons. Stains were hidden with darker petticoats or simply ignored. Blood was seen as a part of life, not to be openly discussed, but not entirely hidden either. On heavy days, she might remain in her private chambers and avoid public duties, but even this was not guaranteed. To manage bad breath or mouth issues, common due to the sugar-heavy diet of the court, Marie Antoinette chewed cloves, cinnamon bark, or perfumed pastilles. Her toothbrush, if used at all, would have been made from animal bone and boar hair, dipped in baking soda or vinegar. Dental hygiene was minimal, and many at court had blackened or rotting teeth. It was considered normal, even fashionable, to cover the mouth with a fan while laughing or speaking. As for relieving herself, the Queen used a chaise percée, a padded upholstered chair with a removable chamber pot beneath it. It was stored behind a screen or in a separate room and emptied by servants. She was never truly alone during these moments either. At least one lady-in-waiting remained close, just in case the Queen needed anything, or in case someone of high enough rank wished to request an audience. Yes, even then. By the time the Queen appeared in public, usually for a walk in the gardens, a card game, or a meal in front of spectators, her body had endured hours of treatment, restraint, and discomfort. Her outward glow, her poise and polish were a careful deception. The glowing skin was paint. The soft perfume was a smokescreen. The wide smile masked aching muscles and irritated skin. And yet, all of this was seen as normal, even enviable. Women of lower rank copied her style. Perfume merchants thrived. Wig makers competed to produce taller, grander, and more ridiculous creations. And in the middle of it all, Marie Antoinette tried to balance being a person and being a symbol of femininity, of fertility, of luxury, of France itself. But this balance would not last. Behind the layers of powder and petticoats, something was cracking. The public, tired of hunger and inflation, began to resent the very rituals that propped up the Queen. The more perfume she wore, the more they smelled deceit. The more wigs she stacked, the more they saw artificiality. And soon her carefully crafted image would become her greatest liability. As you drift further into thought, ask yourself, how long can someone survive as a symbol before the world demands to see the woman underneath? If Versailles was the stage where Marie Antoinette played her role as queen, then the Petit Trianon was where she tried, however briefly and imperfectly, to be herself. But even in her quietest moments, privacy was never truly private. This section explores how Marie tried to escape the filth, performance and surveillance of palace life, and how those very efforts led to more suspicion, gossip, and eventually dangerous resentment. The Petit Trianon was a gift from her husband, Louis XVI, and from the moment it was given to her in 1774, it became the beating heart of scandal. Built originally by Louis XV for his mistress Madame de Pompadour, the small chateau nestled in the gardens of Versailles was, in theory, a peaceful retreat. It allowed the Queen to step away from the rigid etiquette of court, the swarming courtiers, and the grinding repetition of her public role. But unlike most retreats, the Petit Trianon had no real walls to block judgment. Within those walls, Marie Antoinette cultivated a fantasy. She changed out of her heavy court gowns into simpler muslin dresses that clung to her body, soft and light, exactly the kind of fabric associated with peasants. She wore straw hats, walked through rose gardens, and tended to lambs in her miniature farm village, the Hameau de la Reine. But it wasn't a real escape. It was a performance of simplicity, not the thing itself. She still had a full staff. The dairy cows were washed, the chickens were powdered, and the Queen still suffered from the same hygiene constraints as at Versailles, just behind prettier curtains. In fact, some conditions were worse. Without the infrastructure of the palace, limited though it was, the Queen's simpler world lacked even basic water systems. Sanitation at the Hameau was inconsistent. The charm of nature came with all of its messy truths: mud, insects, animals and their smells. The Queen's soft gowns quickly became damp and dirty, and while she might have changed more often, laundry itself was a laborious and delicate task. Her linens were not boiled but gently cleaned by hand to preserve the fabric, which meant stains and smells lingered longer than anyone wanted to admit. Still, Marie clung to this illusion. In the artificial peace of the Hameau, she tried to rewrite the script of her life. Her meals were lighter, her wigs smaller. She took herbal teas, tried imported tooth powders, and even experimented with lemon juice to cleanse her skin. She had her own apothecary, who prepared lavender water and rose oils for cleansing. Some letters suggest she believed these efforts kept her skin clearer and her moods lighter. Perhaps they did, briefly, but the court didn't buy it. They saw her retreat as an insult. The nobles grumbled that the Queen was playing at being a milkmaid while ignoring her duties. The public, hearing rumours of her powdered sheep and gold-rimmed dairy bowls, called her wasteful and childish. Every act of trying to escape became an accusation. Every private moment was interpreted as selfish indulgence. And then there were the bals champêtres, informal balls held in the gardens. Marie would dress herself and her friends in loose gowns without corsets, dancing until midnight under lanterns, laughing freely. These moments were described later in pamphlets as orgies, although they were likely no more scandalous than an aristocratic sleepover. But perception was everything. The Queen's attempts at lightness, her desire to be unburdened, were read as arrogance. She couldn't win. At court she was too aloof. At the Hameau she was too carefree. And all the while, her body was still subject to the same discomforts as any other woman in France. Her pregnancies brought vomiting, fainting and bloating, none of which she was allowed to hide. Her attempts to use vinegar and cloths to ease cramping were whispered about. Her refusal to follow every ceremonial tradition, such as allowing public viewing of her childbirths, was used against her. Even her choice of toiletries, imported soaps, delicate toothbrushes and exotic oils, was reported with venomous exaggeration. One infamous pamphlet, part of the Libelle, anonymous publications meant to destroy her reputation, described the Queen as a creature of filth and perfume in equal measure. They claimed she bathed in milk while peasants starved, that she covered herself in imported oils while rats scurried through the kitchens of France. Some of these accusations were absurd. Others, strangely enough, were echoes of the truth. She did use rare oils. She did prefer scented waters to soap and water. She did surround herself with comfort and retreat from the stench of court life. But not out of cruelty, out of desperation. Even her most personal habits were weaponized. Her menstrual blood became a political topic. Some claimed she used peasant girls to clean her linens. Others suggested her body was too impure to bear royal heirs. And yet Marie had children, 4 in total, 2 of whom died young. Her struggles with miscarriages and infant loss were never treated with sympathy. Instead, they became public talking points. Her womanhood, instead of earning her mercy, became another arena for judgment. Every effort she made to maintain her image, or to perfume, to powder, to step away from stink and scrutiny, only made the public angrier. They wanted her real, but not too real. They wanted her to suffer, but quietly. They wanted her to look the part of France's mother, but not behave like a woman with a body. So, trapped between too much and too little, between silk and sweat, Marie Antoinette found that the line between elegance and vulgarity was razor thin. A little too much perfume? She was vain. A little too little? She was foul. A fresh dress in the country? She was mocking the poor. Staying at court in a stiff gown? She was out of touch. What then was the Queen to do? As the whispers grew, louder and the palace's walls more fragile, she began to withdraw further. Her health declined, her appetite waned, and her once perfect skin began to show signs of stress. The perfumes grew stronger, the smiles more brittle, the visits to the hameau more frequent but less joyful, and still the chamber pots overflowed. As you lie back, still and quiet, ask yourself, can a woman ever be clean enough to escape the dirt thrown by others? By the final years of her reign, Marie Antoinette's carefully composed appearance, her painted face, perfumed body, and elegant gowns, no longer shielded her from the growing storm outside Versailles. Her hygiene practices, once viewed as luxurious, now appeared grotesque to a starving population. The Queen had not changed all that much, but France had, and the contrast between the powdered rooms of the palace and the mud-caked shoes of the people became unbearable. In this final section, we examine how the Queen's very body, how she smelled, how she bathed, how she bled, became political, and how the collapse of her world came not with an explosion, but with a slow unravelling of silk and soap. Even as France teetered on revolution, Marie Antoinette continued her rituals. They were all she had left. The morning lever still occurred, though with fewer nobles. The perfumed cloths were still pressed to her cheeks. Her gowns, though less lavish than before, still bore the marks of royal attention. Hand-embroidered hems, delicate laces, custom bodices. She still powdered her wigs, though not with flour anymore. Bread riots had made such flour use scandalous. Inside Versailles, the Queen attempted to downplay her wealth. She wore simpler gowns modelled after shepherdess fashion, yet they were no less expensive, just differently tailored. She tried to appear more motherly, more French, but the stink of scandal lingered more stubbornly than perfume. No matter how much rose oil she dabbed behind her ears, it could not hide the reek of resentment spreading through the city. During this time, hygiene had shifted into a kind of battlefield. The Queen's reliance on exotic oils, her rejection of harsh soaps, her delicate tooth powders, all of it was suddenly suspect. The press portrayed her as a woman whose body was a lie. She might have smelled of violets and lavender, but her intentions, they said, stank of betrayal. A popular phrase emerged, l'Autrichienne, a play on her Austrian heritage and the word for female dog. She was not simply a foreigner now, she was seen as a foul intruder. As hunger spread and disease returned to the cities, bodily cleanliness took on new meaning. While peasants scraped grime from their skin with handfuls of cold water and ash, the Queen was said to have Turkish baths built at the Petit Trianon. While city women used rags until they were threadbare, pamphlets claimed the Queen discarded hers after a single use. These were not always true, but the truth no longer mattered. Physicians advised more regular bathing in her final years. She bathed infrequently but carefully, soaking in tepid water infused with chamomile or citrus peels. Afterward, she was massaged with scented balms and wrapped in linen. But no bath could wash away the growing fear in her household. Even the palace itself began to smell of unease, the burnt oil of late-night meetings, the mustiness of rooms abandoned by fleeing courtiers, the metallic scent of cold fear. In 1789 the storm broke. The Women's March on Versailles brought thousands of desperate women to the gates of the palace. They demanded bread, but more than that, they demanded justice. The Queen's image had been so thoroughly corrupted by then that even her personal space, her bed, her linens, her body, was part of the fury. When the palace was stormed, soldiers died protecting her rooms. Protesters charged toward the Queen's bedchamber. She escaped down a secret passage. But the moment left a deep scar. She was forced to return to Paris with the royal family, taken to the Tuileries Palace, where privacy disappeared entirely. Her beauty rituals were now watched not by courtiers, but by guards and enemies. Her toiletries were inspected. Her makeup was mocked. Her perfumes were confiscated, seen as frivolous or even suspicious. No longer queen in the traditional sense, she became a prisoner with powdered cheeks. In the Tuileries, her health failed further. She suffered from fatigue, skin rashes, and unexplained bleeding. Her hygiene practices grew sparse, access to supplies was limited, and she had little time or energy to maintain the rituals that had once defined her identity. The woman who had once chosen between rosewater and verbena now had to make do with vinegar and rags. Her corsets loosened, her undergarments became stained and reused, and lice were no longer just court gossip, they were real. And then came the trial. By 1793, Marie Antoinette stood accused of treason. The courtroom was not kind. Even her hygiene was weaponized. They ridiculed her past, the powdered wigs, the imported soaps, the expensive linens. A particularly vile charge claimed she'd committed incest with her young son. It was a lie, but the point was never to find the truth. It was to destroy her completely, to scrub the palace clean of her memory. Her final days were lived in a small prison cell at the conciergerie. She was denied basic dignity. Her bedding was thin, her clothing worn. She was watched constantly, even while changing or relieving herself. The queen who once had a perfumed chaise percée now used a communal chamber pot, emptied by jailers. Her last recorded scent was not rose or lavender, but cold stone, sweat, iron bars, and the faint chalky smell of death. On October 16th, 1793, she was taken to the guillotine. She wore a simple white dress. No powder, no rouge, no perfume. Her hair, once piled high and powdered, was cut roughly to bare her neck. She walked through the streets of Paris, jeered at by crowds, her body a symbol of all the excess they had come to despise, and as the blade fell, silence followed. For a moment the stink of revolution was hushed, but history did not forget the scent of Marie Antoinette. For generations she would remain a symbol of luxury, of corruption, of misunderstood femininity. Her hygiene rituals, so ordinary and so extravagant, would be studied, mimicked, condemned. Her body, perfumed, powdered, scrubbed, and stripped, would be remembered longer than most queens. So tonight, as your mind drifts further into sleep, consider this. Was it ever really about the perfume? Or was it about the fear that behind every sweet-smelling queen there was a truth too dirty to face? The Mughal Empire conjures images of domed palaces, jewelled thrones and glittering silk. But behind the carved lattice screens, called jalis of the harem, the real life of royal women unfolded in quieter, less visible ways. These women, often wives, concubines, and attendants of the emperor, lived in gilded confinement. Their lives were shaped not only by power struggles and court rituals, but by the everyday, physical realities of being a woman. Realities like menstruation, body odour, illness, and the challenges of staying clean in a time before modern plumbing. In this story, we peer past the polished marble and into the hidden world of Mughal harem hygiene. The harem, known as the zenana, was a highly structured and segregated space, designed to keep royal women separate from the outer male-dominated courts. Entry was strictly controlled. Even most men, including noble visitors, were forbidden inside. But far from being mere prisoners, the women in the zenana wielded social and even political influence, some advising emperors, others shaping alliances through marriage. Yet no matter their power, all shared one intimate reality: their bodies, and the struggle to manage them in heat, dust, and close quarters. The architecture of the harem itself was both elegant and functional. Many zenanas had flowing water features, fountains, channels, pools, not just for cooling the space, but for ritual purification. Islamic law required regular washing before prayer, so ablutions, wudu, were built into daily routine. But bathing went beyond religion. It was also cultural, even sensual. The Mughals valued cleanliness deeply, associating fragrance with purity and dignity. A clean body, they believed, reflected a clean soul. Royal women bathed in specially constructed hammams, steam-filled bathhouses often built beneath or adjacent to their living quarters. Heated by hidden furnaces, the hammams released a slow, enveloping mist. Attendants, often female slaves or trusted companions, would assist the women, gently scrubbing their skin with soft cloths and natural exfoliants made of lentil flour, turmeric and sandalwood paste. The baths were luxurious but exhausting. lasting hours. The goal was to emerge not only clean but softened, perfumed, and calm. Scent played a central role. Fragrance was applied in layers, starting with the bathwater itself, which might be infused with rose petals or jasmine blossoms. After bathing, women were massaged with oils, usually sesame or coconut, infused with exotic spices like cardamom or saffron. Musk, a precious and pungent resin, was rubbed on the pulse points. Oud wood was burned to perfume garments and hair. Even between baths, women wore small bags of dried herbs under their clothing or placed fragrant beads in their braided hair. Yet for all this elegance, the struggle to maintain cleanliness was real. The climate was hot, the garments heavy, and the layers of fabric, undergarments, loose trousers and long tunics, soaked up sweat. Laundry was done by servants, but slowly. Soap made from ash or animal fat was coarse and smelled earthy. Clean clothing was a daily priority, but not always possible. During menstruation, women were often given separate beds or quarters. Some had designated moon cycle areas with clean cloths and herbal compresses, while others had to improvise with scraps of linen. Menstrual blood, while not publicly discussed, was silently accommodated. Food, too, affected body odour and digestion. The Mughal court feasted on spicy, rich meals, curries, lentils, meats simmered in ghee. To counteract the effects of such diets, women drank cooling sherbets, chewed cardamom pods, or rinsed their mouths with floral water. Oral hygiene was important, especially in a society where breath, scent, and nearness were part of intimacy. Women used twigs of the miswak tree to clean their teeth. Frayed at one end, the twig acted like a natural brush. Cloves or fennel seeds might be chewed afterward to keep the breath sweet. Privacy was limited. Even in the expansive harems, women lived near one another, slept in shared rooms, and depended on a rotating staff of attendants. There was always someone present: a nursemaid, a masseuse, a hair braider, a guard. Bodily functions could not be completely hidden. Chamber pots were used at night, sometimes perfumed with petals to mask odour. These were emptied by lower-ranked servants, whose jobs were considered impure yet essential. The higher a woman's rank, the more help she had managing these awkward details. But no one was entirely exempt from the basic burdens of the body. Still, some women tried to transcend these limits through ritual and discipline. Princess Jahanara Begum, daughter of Shah Jahan, was famed not just for her poetry and politics, but her hygiene. She's said to have bathed twice daily, even in winter, and demanded fresh linen every morning. She authored a treatise on Sufi ethics that included guidance on bodily purity, noting that the body was a vessel for divine connection. Yet even she, surrounded by eunuchs and advisors, could not entirely escape the claustrophobic closeness of the harem. As the empire matured, so did the expectations of cleanliness. With Persian influence came even more elaborate rituals: hair removal with sugaring paste, black coal to darken eyes and protect against the sun, henna to stain the nails, and fingertips in seasonal patterns. These were not just cosmetic, they were also hygienic, believed to ward off infections and soothe the skin. But there was always a contradiction. The more fragrant, adorned, and pure a woman appeared, the more invisible her true physical self became. A royal harem woman could be draped in silk and jasmine, yet no one outside those walls would ever see her real skin, her chafed thighs, her stained cloths, or the exhaustion in her eyes after hours of grooming. So as you settle under your sheets tonight, try to imagine that other world, humid, hushed, heavy with scent, a place of power, but also of pressure, a marble room echoing with the sound of dripping water, a body scrubbed clean again and again, but never quite free. In the enclosed marble courtyards of the Mughal Zenana, cleanliness wasn't only a matter of self-care, it was deeply political. For the women closest to the emperor, hygiene became performance. The bathhouse, with its steam-filled arches and stone basins, was as much a stage as any royal court. To present oneself to the ruler was not simply to appear beautiful, it was to be pure, fragrant, soft, and prepared. Behind each presentation was a team of women, hours of ritual and a hidden system of status and control tied to the body. In this section, we journey deeper into the intimate preparations of the Mughal royal women, particularly those selected to spend time with the emperor. These rituals were not driven by romantic whimsy. They were rooted in structure, competition, and survival. The ruler did not choose his company at random. Presentation mattered. Skin, scent, cleanliness, breath, and the sheer art of appearing effortless. These were tools of influence, even of power. The preparations for such an audience began the evening before. Attendants would grind fresh pastes of sandalwood and saffron mixed with milk or rosewater. These were applied to the skin in thin layers and left overnight, staining the body faintly gold and perfuming it from within. Special diets were followed, nothing too heavy or greasy. Women were advised to eat cooling foods like cucumber, mint, or yogurt to reduce body heat and keep digestion mild. Some chewed betel leaf mixed with spices, a natural breath freshener and mild stimulant that tinted the lips red. Hair was another focus. Thick, oiled, and often ankle length, it had to be washed, dried, and styled with care. Hair was combed with bone or ivory tools, perfumed with incense smoke, and adorned with jasmine garlands. The ends were dipped in rose oil. Pubic hair was typically removed, either with sugaring paste or a rough cloth and soap. This was not only for aesthetic reasons, it was a religious expectation, as Islam encouraged hair removal, for cleanliness. Painful, certainly. But among elite women, endurance was a quiet badge of honour. One account, recorded by European visitors to the Mughal court, describes how the emperor would pass through a corridor and observe the women from behind a lattice. Though he might not touch or even speak to them, he could see enough: their movements, their poise, their grooming. The favoured ones were summoned later, often to the Khas Mahal, the emperor's private chamber. But the zenana was filled with tension. Dozens of women competed silently through scent, hair, and skin. A missed blemish or the hint of sweat could mean being passed over for months, or forever. The hammam in these moments became a crucible. The steam, the oils, the labour of attendants, it was all focused on transformation, not just cleanliness, but reinvention. Women scrubbed their bodies with loofahs made from plant fibres. After exfoliation, a clay paste called multani mitti was applied to draw out impurities. The hammam was dimly lit, humid, and heavy with scent. Musk, camphor, rose, and sweat all mingling. Time stretched differently here. Some women emerged glowing, others dizzy from heat. It was not luxury, it was maintenance, expectation, duty. Jewellery, while beautiful, also played a part in hygiene. Gold or silver toe rings were believed to balance body energy. Nose rings were seen as pain-relieving for menstrual cramps. Henna was applied to palms and feet, not just for beauty but for cooling. It was thought that dyeing the skin with henna helped lower body temperature. After all, northern India in summer could reach over 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the marble walls of the harem, though thick, were not immune to heat. Inside their quarters, women used incense burners to keep garments and underclothes fresh. Camphor balls were stored with linen to ward off pests. Bedsheets were changed daily in the highest ranks, but not for all. Lower-ranking concubines sometimes shared rooms, even beds. They did their own washing, or relied on other slaves. The hierarchy extended to soap, cloth, even the quality of water used to wash. Water was sacred. Rainwater was stored in stone tanks and filtered through charcoal. In the dry seasons it was limited, and competition grew. The cleanest water went to the emperor and his immediate circle. Others made do with river water carried in brass urns, left to settle so impurities sank to the bottom. Bathing could be a privilege, or a struggle. Menstruation, again, was treated quietly but not shamefully. A woman on her cycle would excuse herself from public or romantic duties. She used soft cloth rags, soaked in herbal washes, sometimes with neem for antiseptic qualities. There was no cotton pad, no disposable solution, only knowledge passed from older women to younger ones. The used cloths were washed in private, often dried in shaded corners away from sunlight to preserve modesty. Sexual hygiene, though rarely written about, was practiced. Through oils and scented balms, women might apply tonics made of frankincense or clove to refresh the body, or use alum stones to tighten the skin. Some believed in herbal pills that claimed to cleanse the womb or restore vigour. These were not always effective, some were dangerous, but they reflected the constant tension between desire, fear, and survival, in a world where a single encounter with the emperor could change one's fate. And yet, despite all the preparation, the reality of intimacy was deeply uncertain. The emperor, surrounded by courtiers and advisors, could be fickle. A concubine might spend hours preparing, only to be ignored. Others, favoured for months, could fall out of grace due to a rumour or a cough. Even beauty could be a burden. Fair skin was admired, but a pale face might suggest illness. A strong fragrance was alluring, but too strong, and it became offensive. The balance was delicate. Some women learned to manipulate this balance. By controlling access to oils, mirrors, or bathing time, higher-ranked women could sabotage rivals. A missing ribbon, a spoiled scent, a borrowed robe that smelled faintly of body odour. These were subtle tools of warfare in the zenana. Cleanliness became currency. Freshness became control. So much of this world, its rules, rituals, and rhythms, revolved around one idea. The body must never betray you. You could not control politics, or the emperor's mind, or your rival's whispers, but you could scrub your skin. You could mask your scent. You could wash, again and again, until you disappeared into cleanliness. But then again, can anyone ever truly wash away the weight of a system designed to make you compete for survival? By now, you followed the silent, steamy trails of the Mughal harem, through the hammam's mist, over the polished stone floors, and past the scented veils of women who lived not just to be seen, but to be chosen. Their rituals were sacred. Their hygiene was meticulous. Their perfumes lingered long after they walked away. But even in all this luxury, a quiet truth hummed beneath the surface. These women were trapped in a system where cleanliness, ironically, had become both their armour and their prison. In this final part of the story, we explore how hygiene, meant as a form of self-respect and spiritual practice, was slowly reshaped into a tool of control and power. The body, once a site of personal reflection and religious purity, became a managed asset, a showpiece to be inspected, evaluated, and ranked. This transformation did not happen overnight. It evolved with generations, with court politics, and with the ever-tightening rules of royal womanhood. The Mughal emperor, surrounded by advisors, generals, and poets, still had to navigate a volatile political world. The zenana, far from being merely decorative, was entangled in this world. Marriages were arranged for diplomacy. Concubines could carry the next heir. A woman's cleanliness wasn't just about attraction, it was about readiness. A clean body meant a potentially fertile one, a manageable one, a desirable one. And once that expectation took root, the body became something less human, more ornamental. Even older women, long past their years of royal favour, were expected to maintain appearances. Dowagers and matriarchs still bathed in the perfumed waters, still wore fresh henna on their nails, still carried themselves with a scent of musk or jasmine. Some had no desire to be seen by men ever again, but the habits had become part of their identity. Their sense of dignity had merged with these routines. If they stopped, they risked slipping into invisibility, worse, into perceived impurity. There's a haunting irony here. In a world where women were rarely seen by outsiders, their every move inside was observed. Attendants noted who woke early to bathe and who did not, which concubine smelled of myrrh and which had stale linen, which woman looked flushed from the steam room and which wore yesterday's makeup. These observations, whispered from one servant to another, shaped reputations. Reputation in turn shaped opportunity. The boundaries between spiritual cleanliness and social survival became blurred. In Islam, purification rituals, ghusl and wudu, were deeply meaningful. Washing was a way to cleanse not just the body but the soul. But in the zenana, these same acts became loaded. You washed not just for God but for the emperor. Not just to pray but to be watched. Cleanliness became currency. Those who could afford better oils, better soap, more attentive servants rose higher. Those who couldn't fell. And what of illness? Disease did not respect beauty. Skin infections, lice, fungal rashes, all were common, even among the elite. The heat, the fabric layers, the crowded quarters, they created a perfect breeding ground for discomfort. Yet women were expected to hide these things. Illness was weakness. It could cost you your place, your safety, your chance. Many masked their pain with perfume, their nausea with floral waters. Some even wore elaborate jewellery to distract from visible symptoms, bracelets to cover rash, veils to hide swelling. Doctors, called hakims, were available, but their access to the zenana was limited. Male physicians could not examine women directly. Female intermediaries described symptoms, sometimes inaccurately. Diagnosis became guesswork. Herbal tonics, cooling baths, and dietary restrictions were standard remedies. Some worked, some didn't. Pain, discomfort, and chronic conditions became part of life, endured quietly behind a veil of rosewater. Over time, a strange paradox emerged. The more these women scrubbed, soaked, and perfumed themselves, the more distant they became from their own physical selves. To be clean, in this world, meant to erase signs of fatigue, aging, and even desire. They had to be ever fragrant, ever youthful, ever pure, until they weren't. Then they were replaced. And yet, many found resilience inside this system. Hygiene was not only a tool of control, it could also be an act of self-claiming. Some women used their bathing rituals as a rare moment of peace. Some passed down recipes for oils and scrubs to their daughters. Some formed bonds with their attendants, sharing laughter and secrets over steam and sandalwood. In a life of restriction, the bath became a space of ritual, of quiet power, and sometimes even of rebellion. Take Gulbadan Begum, the Mughal princess and chronicler. She wrote one of the only surviving first-hand accounts of harem life in her memoir, Humayun Nama. Though she mostly avoided discussing bodily matters, her text gives glimpses of how women shaped their world, through structure, ritual, and community. She hints at how power moved quietly through corridors not just of stone, but of scent, cloth, and water. So what do we learn then from these silent routines? That even in a marble palace, under domes and gold filigree, a woman still had to battle dust, sweat, and expectations. That even in a perfumed bath she might think about her place, her survival, and her freedom. And that cleanliness, so often praised, admired, even spiritual, can also be a weight. A tool. A trap. Tonight, as you lie in your own quiet space, far from palaces and harems, think about those women bathing in silence, about how much was said through scent, through skin, through the simple act of washing, and about how sometimes the things we do every day, bathing, brushing, preparing, carry more history than we realise. In the grand palaces of medieval and Renaissance Europe, royalty was expected to be divine, untouchable, chosen by God. Queens were crowned with gold, dressed in cloth of silver, and made to represent grace and sanctity. But once a month, the illusion cracked. Beneath the velvet gowns and pearl-studded veils, royal women bled like every other woman, and no matter how rich or powerful they were, menstruation remained a private humiliation, hidden, poorly understood, and surrounded by fear. In this first section, we descend into the private chambers of queens and noble women from the 13th to 17th centuries. Here, away from courtly pageantry, they managed their menstrual cycles with crude tools, limited knowledge, and overwhelming silence. These weren't peasant women in dirt-floor cottages. These were the wives and daughters of kings, surrounded by luxury yet powerless against their own biology. Menstruation in medieval Europe was poorly understood. It was seen as both necessary and dangerous. On one hand, the monthly flow was believed to rid the female body of excess humours and toxic blood. On the other hand, it was thought to poison food, wilt flowers, and even harm men. Some texts warned that if a menstruating woman walked through a wheat field, the crops would wither. If she touched wine, it would sour. And if she gazed at a mirror, it would become dull and cloudy. Royal physicians didn't know much more than village healers. The dominant theory of the time was rooted in the ancient Greek idea of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Menstrual blood, they believed, was a release of excess blood that built up due to women's naturally moist and cold temperaments. If this blood didn't exit the body monthly, it would rot and cause madness. Some physicians even argued that menstruation protected women from disease, while others feared it made them unstable. In royal courts, these ideas shaped everything. A queen on her period was expected to avoid religious ceremonies, sexual activity, and even certain foods. Some courts had written or unwritten rules forbidding menstruating women from approaching holy relics or altars. In France, the queen was often the first to kiss sacred objects in public ceremonies, unless she was unclean, in which case someone else stepped in, and the reason was never spoken aloud. So how did they manage the bleeding itself? Before the invention of modern pads or tampons, women used folded linen cloths, tucked between their legs or tied with belts. These were called clouts, or rags, and they had to be washed and reused. Royal women might have had fine linen and attendants to help launder them, but the experience remained deeply uncomfortable. The linen shifted, it leaked, it smelled. Some women tried stuffing wool or moss for added absorption, but even with servants the process was clumsy and far from foolproof. We know from records that Queen Elizabeth I of England, who ruled for over 4 decades, kept a rotating stock of fine cloths, scented with herbs, in a wooden chest in her private chambers. Her ladies-in-waiting were expected to wash them in rosewater and sun-dry them discreetly. Yet even she, the Virgin Queen, who projected godlike strength, had to wrestle with the very human reality of menstrual blood. There are rumours that during her older years, Elizabeth used thicker padding and took special baths to mask the smell, especially during court appearances. But there was a deeper shame tied to menstruation, and it went beyond odour or inconvenience. For royal women, their entire value was tied to fertility. They were expected to bear sons. Each menstrual cycle was a painful reminder of a failed conception. A missed period might bring hope or fear. A blood-stained shift was often more than just an annoyance. It was a monthly symbol of political failure. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, suffered numerous miscarriages and stillbirths. Each time her period returned, she faced scrutiny, not just from her husband, but from the court, the church, and her own attendants. Her body was under constant observation, her cycle a matter of state. When she was no longer menstruating regularly, rumours spread that she had dried up, that she was cursed or unfavoured by God. Eventually, this became part of the justification for her replacement. Some queens tried to track their cycles with astrology. Court astrologers were often consulted not only for battles and treaties, but for childbirth and fertility. Menstrual charts based on the moon and stars were sometimes kept in hidden notebooks. If a queen bled during a lunar eclipse, it was a bad omen. If her period began on a feast day, it was seen as a spiritual sign, though interpretations varied wildly. Pain relief was nearly non-existent. Menstrual cramps were known but not well understood. Women drank herbal teas made from sage, mint or wormwood. Some rubbed their bellies with oil or applied hot stones wrapped in cloth. A few royal women drank wine laced with opium or belladonna, though this could lead to addiction or worse. Bleeding was sometimes heavy and prolonged, what we now call menorrhagia, but without modern medicine, there was little that could be done. The Queen bled in silence, wrapped in linen, her face painted and smiling in public. The secrecy around menstruation bred isolation. Royal women rarely discussed their periods even with each other. The subject was taboo, vulgar, and considered unfit for noble mouths. Yet behind closed doors, maids and ladies-in-waiting whispered tips: how to wash stains from silk, how to dry cloths without attracting attention, how to sit without leaking. Sometimes, a maid would spot a bloodstain before the Queen did. Quick hands would rush in, lifting a hem, offering a shawl, lighting incense to cover the scent, and always the Queen would pretend nothing had happened. So much depended on this cycle of denial. As long as the bleeding remained hidden, the illusion of divine, untouchable femininity could survive. But what toll did that take on a woman, when she had to hide her own body from the world that adored her crown? Because in the end, no matter how many rubies lined her sleeves or how many servants filled her chamber, the Queen still had to deal with red stains, aching hips, and a society that insisted she pretend it wasn't happening. By now, you understand how menstruation was managed in secrecy behind the high walls of Europe's royal palaces. But what makes this part of history especially haunting is not just the discomfort or silence. It's how a woman's menstrual cycle became a matter of public and political concern. In courts where power passed through the womb, bleeding or not bleeding was never just personal. It was surveillance. A queen's body, even at its most private, was considered a public institution. This section takes us deeper into how periods were monitored, discussed, and used as evidence for fertility, legitimacy, and even the favour of God. It may be a quiet subject, but its implications were thunderous. In the royal courts of France, Spain, and England, fertility was paramount. Queens weren't just wives, they were the means by which dynasties continued. If a queen failed to produce a male heir, her value began to deteriorate like silver exposed to air. Every missed period could cause whispers of pregnancy. and if no child came after months of silence, those whispers turned into suspicion, then scorn. In this climate, menstruation wasn't something a queen could experience in solitude. It became a cycle of expectation and disappointment played out before watchful eyes. Servants observed laundry patterns, midwives and nurses took notes, court doctors waited for updates. Even ambassadors from foreign courts requested reports on whether the queen had bled or not. It's shocking in modern terms to imagine that a woman's period could be a diplomatic matter, but it was. Letters between courts contained strange coded language about her state, or the courses of the moon. Everyone was watching, listening, waiting, and sometimes they were faking. In cases where queens or noblewomen didn't menstruate regularly, or not at all, court officials occasionally fabricated evidence of it. Blood was smeared on sheets or nightgowns to suggest health and fertility. These deceptions weren't just theatrical, they were survival tactics. A queen who no longer bled or bled too much could be set aside. This brings us to Anne of Austria, Queen Consort of France and mother of Louis XIV. For many years she failed to produce an heir. The French court buzzed with speculation. Was she cursed? Was she infertile? Was the king not visiting her bed at the right time? Rumours swirled about her menstrual health, though never openly. Her eventual pregnancy was seen as a miracle, but only after a long, stressful wait in which every month of bleeding felt like a verdict. Elizabeth of York, the mother of Henry VIII, is another example. Although little direct evidence survives of her menstrual health, it is known that she gave birth to 8 or 9 children. In between births, she would have endured the cycles of bleeding and recovery. In those days, postpartum menstruation, called the purging of Lockyer, was also considered a kind of unclean state. Even then, a queen was meant to rest, but never too long. Too much rest signalled weakness. Too little rest might prevent future conception. And when it came to younger women, especially princesses being prepared for marriage, the onset of menstruation was treated as a critical milestone, not because it meant womanhood, but because it meant readiness. A menstruating princess could now be married off and expected to bear children. Letters from royal families record these moments as achievements. For instance, when Mary, Queen of Scots, began menstruating at age 12, her tutors informed her family and wedding plans soon followed. Her body had become part of diplomacy before she had even left childhood. It's easy to forget how little autonomy these women had over their own reproductive rhythms. They couldn't refuse marriage, couldn't avoid pregnancy, and couldn't discuss their periods openly. Yet, everything hinged on them. Their ability to bleed regularly, but not excessively, was considered divine favour. Their failure to do so was a sign of danger, even treason. And if a queen bled at the wrong time, that could be catastrophic. For instance, if a woman was believed to be pregnant and then began bleeding, it was interpreted as miscarriage, or worse, as the loss of a potential heir. Such events were sometimes hidden, sometimes blamed on stress or bad omens. In many cases, miscarriages weren't even acknowledged unless they occurred in the later stages of pregnancy. The queen bled in silence, again, often surrounded only by women sworn to secrecy. The church also played a role in reinforcing shame. Canon law forbade menstruating women from taking communion. Some priests even advised kings not to lie with their wives during their bleeding days. There are accounts of queens delaying travel, delaying sex, and even delaying appearances at public ceremonies to avoid being seen as impure. This created logistical headaches at court, where schedules revolved around feasts, religious events, and diplomatic audiences. For the women involved, it meant constant calculation. They had to track their cycles without calendars. Some used beads, others used herbal markers. Some turned to female astrologers for guidance, attempting to align their health with favourable celestial movements. And yet, none of this was spoken aloud. There is almost no direct mention of menstruation in court documents. It lives between the lines, in rumours and euphemisms, in changes of wardrobe or unexplained absences. It's a ghost, ever present but never named. And perhaps that's what makes this history so haunting. Not that it was hidden, but that it had to be hidden, even as it shaped the very course of nations. Behind every throne there was blood, but never enough to speak of. If menstruation was a secret that royal women endured each month in silence, then menopause was the final curtain call. Unlike a first period, which could be quietly celebrated as a sign of fertility and power. The end of bleeding brought no such recognition. It wasn't a relief, it wasn't freedom. It was in many ways a quiet loss of value, a political and personal eclipse. In this final section, we turn to what happened when the bleeding stopped. What did menopause mean for queens and noblewomen? How did courts respond to women who were no longer useful in the biological sense? What did aging, drying and silence do to a woman's place in history? By the time a royal woman reached her mid-40s or early 50s, sometimes younger, given the toll of multiple childbirths and stress, her cycles became irregular. For some, it was a slow decline. For others, the bleeding vanished suddenly and never returned. But in almost every case it was met not with kindness, but with suspicion or neglect. Medical understanding of menopause in the Middle Ages and early modern Europe was crude and often cruel. Women were believed to become dry, not just physically but spiritually. Their bodies were thought to turn cold and bitter. Some physicians claimed that women who no longer bled became more manlike, growing hair, developing rough tempers, or even becoming sexually dangerous. There were even superstitions that postmenopausal women were more likely to become witches. It sounds absurd now, but at the time this belief had dangerous consequences. In regions like Germany, Switzerland, and parts of England during the 15th and 16th centuries, many women accused of witchcraft were older, childless, and postmenopausal. Their lack of bleeding made them, in the eyes of the church, unnatural. Their wombs were empty. Their bodies gave no life. That was enough to raise suspicion. They were no longer useful to the court, the family, or the church, and so they were considered threatening. Inside royal palaces, these attitudes manifested in quieter ways. Queens who reached menopause often found themselves quietly pushed to the margins. Their chambers were moved farther from the king's. They were no longer expected to attend fertility rituals or consult with midwives. Some were even replaced, either through annulment or remarriage, under the claim that their barrenness made the marriage spiritually void. Catherine of Aragon, mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most famous example of this slow political dismissal. When her ability to conceive faded, Henry VIII began to look elsewhere. It wasn't just her age. It was the end of her menstrual cycle that sealed her fate in the eyes of the court. She could no longer promise an heir. Her blood had dried, and so too had her political worth. What's particularly sad is how many of these women internalise the shame. Personal letters and diary fragments, few though they are, reveal a tone of resignation, even guilt. Some noble women prayed for bleeding to return. Others reported phantom flows, believing they were still menstruating, when in fact their cycles had long since ended. The silence around menopause was so total that many women didn't know what was happening to them. Some believed they were ill or cursed. Menopause was often treated not as a natural transition, but as a kind of death, the death of beauty, youth, and usefulness. No more crimson cloths, no more hopeful whispers, just a slow retreat from the spotlight. But it wasn't all shame. Some royal women, freed from the constant scrutiny of fertility, found space to grow in other directions. With childbearing expectations behind them, a few became political advisors, regents, or educators. Anne of Bohemia, for example, became a patron of the arts and education after her childbearing years. Dowager queens sometimes took on powerful roles, especially if they were widowed. Yet their strength was rarely linked to their womanhood. It was allowed only because their biology had been rendered neutral. Still, the language never changed. These women were described as spent, hollow, or used. Their stories were quietly wrapped up while kings aged into long reigns without consequence. A king could remain a king even in his 70s. A queen without blood and without children was simply a relic. Even the architecture of royal spaces reflects this erasure. In many castles, dowager queens were moved to separate wings or smaller houses entirely. Their lives continued in parallel to the court, often forgotten unless they reappeared for a christening or funeral. Their bodies, no longer of interest, faded from public view. The bleeding had ended, and with it, their perceived role in the theatre of monarchy. And yet, despite all this, they endured. They taught. They advised. They remembered. Their silence became part of the story, an invisible but powerful current beneath history. We may never know the full extent of what royal women thought about their bodies because so little was written. and even less survived. But in every forgotten chamber, every stained linen, and every unsaid word, the truth lingers. They bled, they stopped, and the world looked away. But we don't have to. Let's begin with a question no one asked out loud in the royal courts of the past, but one that hovered heavily in the air. What did it smell like to be a royal woman? We don't usually think of queens, princesses, or noble ladies as having body odour. Their portraits show powdered skin, glistening pearls, and faint smiles behind delicate fans. But beneath those silks and beneath those corsets was still a human body. One that sweated, one that bled, one that decayed slowly in the heat of candlelit rooms and unwashed garments. And no amount of perfume could truly hide it. This is the forgotten world of royal female hygiene. Not the bathing rituals, but the hidden, perfumed war against body odour. And it was a battle women were expected to win quietly. Let's travel to 17th century France, to the heavily perfumed court of Louis XIV. Versailles was magnificent in appearance, but rank in reality. The palace had no proper sewage system, and the corridors often stank of sweat, rot, and chamber pot waste. Now imagine a royal woman in this world, dressed in multiple layers of velvet and silk with a tight corset that trapped heat and compressed her organs. She might not have bathed in weeks. The ideal woman of the time was one who smelled like flowers, but her body, especially during menstruation or illness, often betrayed her. What did she do? She powdered, she perfumed, she stuffed. One of the most common methods to combat genital and menstrual odour was the use of fumigated cloths, or scented wads, inserted into the vaginal canal or tucked beneath petticoats. These were sometimes soaked in rose water, vinegar, myrrh, or ambergris. Whale vomit prized for its rich scent. The aim was not just to smell good, but to mask the reality of the human body. Royal women would also douse their undergarments with perfumes, not only to freshen them, but because the linen itself often absorbed unpleasant smells. Without regular washing and with little access to clean water, these linen layers became scent traps. Some ladies wore sachets of dried herbs like lavender or mint tied around their thighs or beneath their breasts. In hotter climates or during menstruation, multiple sachets might be used at once. But these methods were also dangerous. Some substances used in vaginal scenting caused irritation, infection, or worse. Alum, borax, or camphor were used for both cleansing and tightening, creating a clean smell while drying out the vaginal walls. In cases where the goal was to seem youthful or virginal, women might use acidic rinses to erase natural scent. But this often led to ulcers, internal bleeding, or sterility. And yet the pressure remained. In royal marriage markets, odour was not just unpleasant, it was suspicious. A woman who smelled off might be thought diseased or unclean. Whispers could destroy reputations. One Spanish noblewoman was rejected for marriage after rumours spread about her body's overripeness. She had no known illness, but her scent spoke louder than her family's fortune. Among the upper classes, doctors created elaborate recipes to treat feminine humours, which were often just normal bodily functions misunderstood. Vaginal discharge was seen as a sign of imbalance. Sweat beneath the breasts or in the groin was a failure of discipline. Many doctors recommended daily dabbing with vinegar-soaked cloths, or frequent application of mercury-based powders to kill odour-causing worms of heat. These powders were toxic, of course, but a woman who smelled strange was worse than one who risked her health. Perfume houses thrived under this pressure. In 18th century Paris, one could order womb water or flower tincture for the lower regions. These weren't always applied directly. Sometimes noble women poured them into their bath water, if they bathed at all, or used them in handkerchiefs placed discreetly on their laps. Scented gloves became common too, since a lady's hands often carried sweat from adjusting her corset or brushing her thighs. But the use of perfumes was also a class marker. A woman who could afford ambergris, musk, or imported rose essence was considered refined. A peasant woman smelling of garlic and hay might be overlooked. So the battle against odour became not only personal, but political. It was a matter of rank, of worth, of femininity itself. Yet the tragedy of it all lies in this simple truth. No one was allowed to speak of it. Odour had no vocabulary in polite court conversation. Women were taught to smile through the discomfort, to endure rashes, to powder sores, to pretend that their wombs did not sweat. They were expected to smell like spring, even in the depths of their bodies' worst days. And so, while kings flaunted their Mistresses and courtiers strutted in wigs that reeked of pomade. Queens sat quietly with dried roses sewn into their petticoats. Their bodies, silenced beneath layers of fabric and fragrance, told a story no one wanted to hear. But you can almost smell it now, can't you? The roses, the vinegar, the sweat, the shame, all covered, all forgotten. Imagine now that you're a royal lady in the height of summer. The court is in full swing, with music echoing off marble halls, dancers gliding over polished floors, and noblemen swirling goblets of spiced wine. You must be seen, must smile, must glide, must breathe. But beneath your bodice, your skin is slick with sweat, your linen shift is damp, and between your thighs the heat gathers. No one must notice. No one must ever know. In this section, we step deeper into the hidden strategies of covering odour and discomfort in royal settings, where scent could betray even the most powerful of women, and where silence was stitched into every hem. The daily clothing of a royal woman was not light. A single outfit could involve a chemise, petticoat, bodice, overskirt, farthingale, corset, ruff, sleeves, and veil, often in heavy brocade, velvet, or taffeta. And beneath all this, the body continued its quiet labour, sweating, discharging, bleeding. The solution? Layers of linen to soak it all up. Women wore shifts, thin linen underdresses, that acted as the first line of defence. These were often the only garments washed regularly, if at all. Wealthy ladies might change shifts daily, but bathing was still infrequent, and even fresh linen could not prevent the build-up of odours, especially in the groin and underarm areas. To help, women often tucked small perfumed cloths under their arms or between their legs. These pads, sometimes called mouches or garnitures, could be soaked in floral water, vinegar, or ground herbs. During menstruation, women used clouts, basic rags or folded linen strips tucked inside the legs and held in place with a belt or cloth ties. These rags were reused, rinsed, and hung to dry in private. But in a palace, privacy was rare. Servants might glimpse them. Gossip could start from a single bloodstain. So the rags were sometimes scented with rosemary or lavender, not for comfort, but to mask any trace of menstruation. Corsets added another layer of difficulty. Tightly laced and pressing against the ribcage, a corset restricted breathing and circulation. It also trapped sweat. Some noble women lined their corsets with herbs, or wrapped their torsos in scented cloths before dressing. The goal was not hygiene, it was deception. As long as no one saw or smelled the evidence, it could be pretended away. In the hot months, royal ladies sometimes fainted from the combined pressure of tight clothing, lack of airflow, and internal heat. But even this was romanticised. A swooning woman was considered delicate, fragile, feminine. No one spoke of the rashes under her arms, the irritation between her legs, or the ache in her lower back. Perfumed fans became tools of survival. With a flick of the wrist, a lady could waft scent toward her nose or more subtly away from her body. Some even soaked the fan's cloth edge in perfume to keep the smell close. Small containers called pomanders were also popular, metal balls filled with wax or sponge soaked in oils. These could be hung from a belt or hidden inside a sleeve, allowing discreet scenting throughout the day. Court etiquette required women to sit still for long periods. This made the scent of the body more concentrated, especially after hours in the same position. It was common for women to place fresh flower petals beneath their gowns before a formal event. Some even wore floral crowns, not just as decoration, but as a fragrant distraction. But what if a woman failed to mask her scent? The consequences could be subtle and cruel. A lady-in-waiting might be reassigned. A queen might find herself criticised in letters or whispers. Some women were accused of being rank or decaying, language that quickly became tied to ideas of infertility, moral decay, or sin. A single unpleasant smell could destroy a reputation. Even queens were not immune. Marie Antoinette, long before her downfall, was mocked in pamphlets that described her as ripe and spoiled beneath the roses. These were fictional insults, of course, but they tapped into a widespread anxiety, that beneath the powder and perfume something unclean was always lurking. And still, women were expected to remain graceful. They practiced sitting with legs slightly apart to allow air to circulate. They dabbed their necks with rosewater behind closed doors. They whispered to maids about fresh cloths and chamber matters, never daring to name the body directly. Even their language was scented and evasive. All the while the palace smelled of sweat, of urine, of mould in the tapestries and dust in the curtains. But only women bore the blame for their scent. Male courtiers were allowed to stink, to drink, to sweat through their collars and collapse in their boots. But a woman, she had to float, and to float she had to hide. So, each morning, a royal lady began her quiet ritual, layering powder and perfume not just on her skin, but on the memory of her own body, masking every sign that she was human. But can a person really cover up their nature forever? By now, it's clear that in royal courts, the human body, especially the female body, was not simply hidden beneath silks. It was disguised, controlled, and in many cases silenced. But it wasn't just about odour. The war on female scent was part of something bigger, a war on female presence. Smelling like a woman meant being a woman, and in many royal cultures that meant being something to be disciplined, not celebrated. Let's go deeper into this pattern. As medical understanding stagnated in much of Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern period, physicians often blamed women's bodies for both visible and invisible ailments. The womb was believed to be a volatile organ. It wandered, it leaked, it rotted. A woman's scent was seen not as a neutral side effect of being alive, but as a symptom of disease, moral failing, or even witchcraft. In the 15th and 16th centuries, it wasn't unusual for a woman who smelled off to be examined for signs of demonic influence. Foul-smelling vaginal discharge could be interpreted as punishment for sin or promiscuity. Midwives and wise women were sometimes accused of creating womb poisons to cause miscarriages or illness, when, in reality, they were treating infections caused by unhygienic conditions. This stigma made noble women terrified of bodily exposure. In many royal courts, a queen would only be examined during childbirth, and even then modesty was enforced. Curtains surrounded the bed. Male physicians stood at a distance, issuing instructions as female attendants did the real work. Everything was mediated to avoid what was considered the shame of feminine odour and fluids. So, noble women learned to manage themselves in silence. In 18th century Russia, Catherine the Great insisted on lavender baths and had her bed linens changed daily, rare luxuries at the time. She ordered perfume to be applied not only to her clothes, but to her footstools and writing desks, creating an air of floral sterility around her. But she was the exception, not the rule. Most royal women had to make do with scented gloves, dried herbs sewn into corset linings, or rosewater rubbed on the insides of the thighs. These practices may seem quaint now, but they took time, money, and secrecy. Ladies often kept their perfuming rituals locked away in what was called a toilette, a private dressing routine that could take hours. Attendants were trained to pretend not to notice sores, rashes, or blood. Some women even carried silver tongs for removing soiled cloths discreetly. Bodily scent was a betrayal, and to protect themselves, women built fortresses of fragrance. But no scent lasts forever. Eventually the perfume faded. The linen grew stiff. The skin became irritated. Some women bled through their clothes in silence. Others passed out during long court rituals, and still they said nothing. It wasn't just about masking the scent. It was about maintaining an illusion that women were always clean, always composed, always otherworldly. And so the royal woman became an impossibility, human on the inside, inhuman on the outside. Her body became a contradiction, meant to bear heirs, yet never be seen or smelled. She could give birth to the future of a kingdom, yet never mention her bleeding. She could wear pounds of gold and silk, yet not own the skin beneath it. And if she failed, if her scent escaped, if her cloth slipped, if someone caught a whiff of something not sanctioned by the perfumers, she could be punished. Not always, officially, but socially, silently. A look, a whisper, a refusal to be seated beside her at supper. It didn't take much. Even centuries later, these quiet punishments linger. The modern pressure on women to smell fresh, clean, fruity, floral. It all has roots in these royal rituals. The shelves of drugstores and luxury boutiques still whisper the same old lie. That the female body must be covered, corrected, and controlled. That being human isn't quite good enough. And so, from Versailles to Vienna, from Florence to St. Petersburg, royal women lived their lives wrapped in perfumes and powder, trying to keep the truth of their bodies at bay. The scent of their real lives, sweat, blood, discharge, desire, was wiped away with every lavender sprig tucked into a petticoat. But history remembers the fragrance, even if it pretends to forget the body beneath it. The notion of a royal lady seated regally upon her throne evokes images of grace, poise, and power. But not all royal seats were carved from marble or gilded in gold. Some were made of wood, shaped like stools, hollowed in the middle, and designed not for judgment or ceremony, but for smoke, thick, herb-laden smoke that curled upward into the most private parts of a queen's body. This was the mysterious, now half-forgotten practice of womb fumigation. Before antiseptics, before antibiotics, and long before gynecological knowledge had any real footing in science, women across royal courts were told that their wombs needed to be aired out, smoked out, or coaxed into obedience through heat and vapours. The womb was a temperamental organ, so they believed, liable to shift, wander, rot, or stagnate without proper care, and queens, whose wombs were expected to produce heirs, had to keep theirs not only functional, but fragrant. Picture a chamber deep inside a palace, dimly lit, curtained, and hot with steam and incense. A queen, undressed from the waist down, lowers herself onto a fumigation stool. Beneath the open seat, a shallow bowl of burning herbs, cloves, myrrh, rosemary, sometimes even sulphur. The smoke rises gently, curling up into her body. She sits there for minutes, or sometimes hours, sweating, breathing, hoping it works. This was no luxury spa treatment. Womb fumigation was considered a medical necessity. In medieval and early modern Europe, medical texts claimed that bad airs caused disease in the womb. Menstruation was thought to cleanse these humours, but if a woman's period stopped or became irregular, it was believed that deadly toxins built up inside her. Fumigation was meant to draw them out. If the herbs smoked upward freely, that was a sign of a healthy, open womb. But if the smoke was blocked, or if the woman felt faint, this suggested blockages, stagnation, or corruption. The practice had roots as far back as ancient Greece and Rome. Hippocratic physicians believed the uterus was an animal-like organ that could wander through the body, strangling other organs if neglected. They advised young brides and older queens alike to use fragrant smoke to lure the womb back into place. And as Christianity spread across Europe, these old beliefs simply dressed themselves in new robes. For royal women, the stakes were high. A queen's value was closely tied to her fertility. If she failed to produce an heir, or worse, if she gave birth to stillborn children or suffered repeated miscarriages, whispers would begin. Maybe her womb was corrupted, maybe she was cursed, maybe she didn't cleanse herself properly. And so the ritual began. Every few weeks, or before a major court appearance, a queen might be led into her private chambers by her ladies-in-waiting. The stool would be prepared, the herbs would be selected based on the season, her mood, or the latest advice from a royal physician. Basil and rose in the summer, wormwood and sage in winter. Sometimes wine or vinegar would be added to the mix, creating a sharper sting to the rising vapours. The queen would then undress from the waist down, sit carefully, and wait. There was discomfort, heat, an odd dampness. But there was also a strange sense of peace. It was one of the few moments when a royal woman could be alone, or at least alone enough to hear her own thoughts. Some wrote of the feeling as meditative, others simply endured it, counting the minutes, watching the smoke curl around her knees. There were, of course, risks. Prolonged fumigation could lead to burns or infections. The use of toxic herbs, like henbane or mercury compounds, could cause fainting, delirium, or even long-term damage. But in the absence of alternatives, the practice persisted. Medical knowledge was limited, but tradition was strong. Over time, fumigation took on symbolic meaning. To smoke the womb was to show that a woman was preparing herself for conception, or for purification after childbirth. It was a sign of discipline, hygiene, and even devotion. Royal households kept careful records of when and how these fumigations took place. They were sometimes ordered by physicians, but often directed by elder women, noble matrons who had gone through childbirth themselves and believed deeply in the practice. In Russia, Tsarina Alexandra Romanova was known to have used fumigation herbs during her struggle to produce a male heir. In Spain, Queen Isabella reportedly carried small pouches of burning herbs under her skirts, releasing smoke gently as she walked. And in France, the mistresses of Louis XV swore by a secret blend of ambergris, cinnamon and dried rose petals, a blend so potent that it perfumed the entire wing of the palace. But not all royal women embraced the practice. Some resisted. Queen Elizabeth I of England, ever conscious of her image, avoided visible signs of feminine care. She preferred to douse herself in perfumes and powders, letting the myth of her virgin queen body remain untouched by smoke or ritual. Others, like Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, reportedly wept during fumigation, describing it as humiliating and invasive. But still, they submitted. The kingdom needed heirs, and the womb, they were told, needed smoke. This hidden practice of royal hygiene, tucked into medical manuals and whispered among ladies in waiting, reminds us how little was understood and how much was expected. Royal women were supposed to be pure, but also fertile, silent, but also productive, human, yet somehow above the unpleasant facts of biology, and so they smoked, quietly, repeatedly, all in the name of duty. But did the fumigated womb actually work as promised? The womb, in the royal imagination, was not merely an organ. It was a sacred tunnel through which nations were born. Monarchs, dynasties and treaties all depended on it. And so, when something so invisible held such monumental power, rituals like fumigation became almost mystical in importance. They weren't just cleaning, they were preparing a holy chamber for a royal heir. Let's return now to the seats, the smoke, and the silence. Most fumigation stools were simple in design, wooden, sometimes padded with soft cloth, always with a central opening where the smoke could rise. But in wealthier courts these stools were carved with delicate patterns, sometimes inlaid with silver or gold. They were tucked into private rooms alongside perfumes, oils and prayer books. A queen's toilette, her dressing ritual, was as much about control as it was about cleanliness. Royal physicians insisted that fumigation would balance a woman's humours, the ancient system of bodily fluids believed to regulate health. When a queen was too cold or wet in her temperament, which supposedly led to infertility or lethargy, warm, fragrant smoke would be prescribed. If she was too dry, or suffered from what was called womb melancholy, more moistening herbs were added to the mix. Some herbs were chosen not just for their smell, but for their symbolic meaning. Rose petals for purity, clove for strength, laurel for divine favour. It wasn't uncommon for a priest to bless the herbs before fumigation, especially if a queen had recently lost a child or had trouble conceiving. Science and religion overlapped in the smoke. But the process could be complicated. If a queen had irregular periods, fumigation might be ordered more frequently. If she had recently given birth, it was used to dry out the womb and prevent infection. If she had not yet conceived after marriage, it became a monthly ordeal, each time laced with hope and dread. And if she had suffered a miscarriage, the fumigation took on the aura of mourning. Some queens believed deeply in the process. Others hated it. Anne of Austria, the mother of Louis XIV, recorded in her letters the frustration of repeated fumigations that failed to produce a child during the early years of her marriage. She wrote about the heat, the discomfort, and the shame of being told her womb was too sluggish. Yet she persisted. Her eventual pregnancy, after years of ritual and prayer, was seen as proof that the fumigations had cleansed her properly. In the Ottoman Empire, royal women also engaged in similar practices, though the terminology differed. The harem's inner quarters often included steam baths and herbal sittings, where women would sit on bowls of steaming mixtures, including frankincense, mastic, and dried orange peels. These sessions were part purification, part relaxation, and part grooming. But they also carried the pressure of competition. After all, a concubine's rank could rise or fall depending on her ability to bear a child. In China's imperial court, similar practices took shape under different names. Empresses and concubines were sometimes prescribed warm herb baths, followed by vaginal steaming in preparation for the emperor's visits. Here too, health, beauty and fertility were treated as one. Scent became a form of silent diplomacy. A woman who smelled clean, sweet and herbal was considered more fit for the emperor's touch. This obsession with womb scent extended beyond private ritual. In many courts, midwives and physicians would smell the genital area as part of their examination. A foul odour was seen as a warning sign, not only of illness, but of moral laxity. A sweet-smelling womb, by contrast, was praised in euphemistic poetry, letters, and court gossip. Perfumed vaginal cloths became status symbols among the nobility. And yet, behind the curtain, these rituals took a toll. The repeated exposure to smoke could lead to irritation, dryness, or even internal burns. Some herbs used, like juniper, pennyroyal, or camphor, could be toxic in high doses. Women often didn't know the exact contents of the mixtures used. Their attendants or court physicians controlled that knowledge, and there was no room to question authority. If a woman protested, she was said to be disobedient to healing. Even worse, these rituals often became tied to blame. If a queen failed to conceive, it wasn't the king's fault, it was her cold or blocked womb. If a child was born weak or ill, some would whisper that the mother must have skipped her fumigations or chosen the wrong herbs. If she miscarried repeatedly, the fumigation was not stopped, it was doubled. The smoke became both prescription and punishment. In some cases, the practice was more ceremonial than medical. But the pressure was always real. It wasn't just about health. It was about duty. A queen's body wasn't hers alone. It belonged to her family, her nation, and her god. Every choice, every scent, carried weight. She could not simply choose to abstain from these rituals. They were expected, enforced, measured in outcomes. And for many royal women, this meant sacrificing comfort, privacy, and dignity for the hope of producing a single, healthy child. As centuries passed and medical, understanding advanced womb fumigation began to fade. But its echo lingers in modern practices of vaginal steaming, in whispered shame about women's natural scent, and in the long, unspoken pressure for women to sanitize their bodies in order to be seen as worthy. The stool may be gone, the smoke may have cleared, but the expectation that a woman's body must be clean to be valuable remains, drifting quietly through time. Still, one wonders, did these queens ever sit upon those burning stools and think, what if the problem isn't me? What if the smoke isn't cleansing me, but silencing me? In the quiet corners of Europe's palaces, where velvet curtains muffled the whispers of the court and firelight flickered softly across marble tiles, the last wisps of scented smoke still curled upward from beneath the wooden stool. The queens who sat there rarely spoke of it. Their letters made brief mention of treatments, steamings, or herbings. The practice of womb fumigation, so deeply tied to a royal woman's sense of duty, shame, and survival, was never meant to be public knowledge. It faded quietly, just as it had persisted quietly, smothered under layers of incense and silence. But its legacy, strangely enough, did not disappear with it. Let's sit with one of these queens for a moment. It could be any of them. Perhaps Catherine de' Medici in the darkened rooms of the Château de Blois, or perhaps Maria Carolina of Naples, sweating in a locked chamber as the smoke billows. Picture her from behind, upright, unmoving, alone. She's not speaking. Her ladies-in-waiting are nearby, but hushed. The herbs beneath her are carefully measured. Dried mugwort, some thyme, a handful of bitter orange peel. A brazier warms the air. The chamber smells of something both floral and burnt. She's not told to think, just to sit, to let the smoke do its work. This was a recurring moment in a queen's life, a quiet form of obedience repeated monthly or seasonally, after childbirth, before royal visits, or in times of perceived imbalance. She would sit for 20 minutes, sometimes more. Not because she believed deeply in the process, but because everyone around her did. Even as medical theories began to shift in the 17th and 18th centuries, the inertia of tradition held fast. Humoral theory, this ancient system of balancing bodily fluids, still whispered its judgments into the ears of court doctors and elder midwives. The womb is too cold, they would say. She has retained bad blood. There is blockage. No proof was needed beyond the absence of pregnancy or the presence of irregular bleeding. The solution was almost always the same: heat, herbs, and patience. And so, for generations, royal women submitted to fumigation not as medicine, but as ritual. It was deeply symbolic. The act of sitting over fragrant smoke mirrored religious purification practices, like incense rising during mass or offerings into ancient temples. Just as a priest burned frankincense to cleanse a space for divine presence, the Queen's body was being prepared to house the divine miracle of life. Her womb, like a sacred vessel, needed smoke to be made worthy. Yet the process was far from divine in sensation. The warmth could turn into burning if the coals were too close. Some herbs caused stinging or dryness. Women fainted. Others simply grew numb. The smoke lingered on the skin, in the folds of clothing and in the bed linens. And though the ritual had been born from spiritual ideals, it gradually became something else, a mechanical expectation, a performance of wellness. Even when physicians began to adopt more modern anatomical theories, discovering the ovaries, mapping menstruation more clearly, fumigation hung on at the fringes. There was still no full understanding of infection, no awareness of bacteria or internal flora. A woman's womb, especially a queen's, was still seen as fragile, temperamental and in need of management. And in truth, fumigation wasn't only about fertility. It also became a way to erase the body's natural scent, something that, in court culture, was quietly policed. A queen was expected to smell sweet, light and floral. Musky odours, sweat, or the smell of menstruation were considered shameful. Fumigation replaced the body's truth with perfumed fiction. It allowed royal women to present themselves as smooth, odourless icons, idealised bodies ready to appear at court without the hint of real flesh. For some, it was empowering in a strange way. The chamber where fumigation occurred was private, intimate. It was one of the few places where a royal woman might sit without speaking, without smiling, without being observed. No one expected her to perform in that moment. Even if the ritual itself was controlling, the solitude it granted could be soothing. A queen might sit, listen to her own breath, and let herself exist without expectation, for just a moment. But the cost was subtle and long-lasting. When a woman's scent is treated as a problem to be corrected, it teaches her something about shame. When her fertility is tied to smoky rituals and herbal burns, she learns to associate reproduction with purification, not pleasure. When her body is seen as a political tool, she is taught to suppress every discomfort for the sake of the dynasty. And when the rituals don't work, when pregnancy still eludes her, or when miscarriages still occur, she often blames herself. As modernity approached, fumigation began to fall out of favour. New ideas were arriving, carried on the pens of Enlightenment doctors and anatomists. Men like William Hunter and his peers began publishing anatomical illustrations that challenged the old beliefs. Midwives began to rely more on observation than on herbal superstition. Cleanliness, slowly, began to mean soap and warm water, not smoke. But even as the practice ended, echoes of it lingered. By the 19th century, vaginal douching had replaced fumigation in many royal and noble households. These too were often herbal or perfumed, though now using syringes and glass instruments. The idea was the same: to cleanse, to deodorize, to maintain the illusion of floral purity. Later still, in the early 20th century, advertisements for feminine hygiene products would appear in women's magazines, promising freshness, marital happiness, and cleanliness. And even today, the idea survives in certain corners of modern beauty culture. Vaginal steaming spas, offering sessions with rose petals, ylang-ylang or lavender, have emerged in urban wellness circles, often marketed as ancient wisdom. Celebrities praise them, influencers film them. But rarely do these discussions acknowledge the long, complex and often painful history that fumigation carries, especially for women whose bodies were not their own to begin with. The queens who endured it did so out of duty, out of hope, out of the fear that if they didn't, they might fail as women, as wives and as monarchs. And now, we must ask, did these women ever wonder, sitting on those burning stools, inhaling the scent of cloves and myrrh, if it all meant anything, if their body was truly broken, or if the world simply feared what it could not understand? There is something haunting about the idea that for centuries women were told their most private spaces were impure, that their natural state needed fixing, that their bodies were dangerous unless controlled. But perhaps the most lasting part of this forgotten ritual is not the stool or the smoke, but the silence of women who endured discomfort quietly, the silence in medical texts that rarely describe the pain, the silence in royal histories that overlook the private sacrifices behind every healthy heir. and the silence that still surrounds the conversation about how we define cleanliness today. As the smoke rose, perhaps one queen thought, not about purity or duty or sin, but simply this: what would it feel like to be left alone, to be seen as whole without the burn, the scent or the ritual, to breathe freely without the weight of perfumed expectations? That, perhaps, is the final question womb fumigation leaves behind. Not about medicine, but about how history treats the bodies of its most silent players.